Can everyone hear me without the mic? I move a lot, so I'm going to try and not use that mic. If we've been paying attention. Does anyone know what we're looking at? Throw it out. Yay, we've been paying attention. And it might be something very familiar to you. So this is a woodcut, a lithographed woodcut from the 16th century by Andreas Vesalius. He was a 16th century physician. And whenever I look at this, I just think about how intimately you must know a part of the body to be able to cut it into wood accurately, right? And so does anyone know what the origin of the word vagus is for the vagus nerve?
Wandering.
Yes. Where are you? I love etymology, so thank you. It's Latin for wandering and also for strolling is another word for it. And so what I like about this image and also the background of the word vagus is that it really is telling what the vagus nerve does in the body. It's all about wandering and strolling through the body. And strolling is our nervous system's way of taking an inventory. So we often think about what a nerve is doing. One of the things that our vagus nerve is doing is strolling. So when you're going from A to B, you don't necessarily notice everything. You know, there's those things of like, look for the bear, or don't look for the bear with the basketball game, where there's the bear that walks through a court, and because you're supposed to be counting something, you don't see the bear. The vagus nerve would see the bear, because it's strolling. It doesn't have this very specific, it has lots of things it does, which we'll see in the next slide. This is what classic medical texts and most clinical texts would be showing us about the vagus nerve. So, I can see them here. The vagus nerve is a cranial nerve, and what we see usually is what it's innervating. We're seeing what it does. So we're taught, you can see that the top ones are other parts of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the bottom ones from the pelvis, also parasympathetic nervous system. For those of you who don't know what that means, that's our rest and digest state. But the vagus nerve is the one with the most connections. And most of those connections are below the neck, right? And what it does, what it's best known for is vasodilation, so dropping blood pressure, slowing the heart rate, stimulating digestion, and getting the bowels regulated. So that's generally what we learn about the vagus nerve when we're taught about it in modern day. What's lost in this image is how the vagus nerve does what it does. There's almost like a hyphae, like a wandering intricacy of doing along with listening and responding. You can't wrap yourself around a heart without also feeling what the heart is telling you, right? So it's not just doing something to the heart, it's not just doing something to the gut. It is also taking in information from that gut. And so this is perhaps what we could best call a gut feeling. So from a gut feeling, we'll move into that screen. Oops. So this is the more kind of all of the content in one spot. So what we're used to when we think of the brain, we think of the central nervous system. That's your far left. So the brain is where we have thought and cognition. It's where we always think all of our processes are happening up there. As we've learned from these beautiful speakers, we know that there's more to it than that. There's about 85 billion neurons, about 100 neurotransmitters. 5% of the serotonin in our bodies is produced there. 50% of the dopamine is produced there. The rest is mostly produced on the far right, in the enteric nervous system. To be clear, the ones that are created in the enteric nervous system don't do the same thing. So serotonin in the gut does not do the same thing to the body that serotonin in the brain does. Just to be really clear about that. But we know that there's an enormous amount of neurotransmitter developing in the enteric nervous system. Then we also have, outside of the central nervous system, there's the parasympathetic, rest and digest, and then we have our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight and flight. So most of us have probably heard of that terminology before. Parasympathetic it's slower, it's all about safety and support. Our sympathetic, fight and flight, it's urgent, so it's very reactive, it's fearful, and it generally occurs in spaces of aloneness, isolation. So that is all part of our first brain. Our second brain is in that enteric nervous system. It's everything that has been spoken about before is in between the two layers of tissue in that tube. I like to think of us like an inner tube, like our skin is the outside and our gut is the inside of that inner tube. That in there's two layers of tissue, and there's tons and tons of cells that are creating and communicating. It's where we're able to, if you feel butterflies in your stomach, or if you feel rumbling in your stomach, that's interoception. That's your capacity to understand what your body's saying to you. And that's where gut feelings exist. One of the interesting things about this is that gut-brain axis, that telephone line that Dr. Finley was talking about. This is the space where the gut-brain connection exists. This is the gut-brain axis. So the vagus nerve is coming from the cranium down through, there's two vagus nerves. We always talk about one, so they come down the side like that beautiful image showed. It comes down and wanders through the body. And so then when it lands in the gut, what we have found out is that those enteroendocrine cells, they actually have neurons that synapse with our vagus nerve. So that doesn't sound that interesting, but that's like a really big piece of, there's somebody picking up the phone on that telephone line. And so this is a really key piece of how is it possible that we could really have gut feelings. Now, and the reason that that's really important is that when you look at the fibers of the vagus nerve, 90% of the fibers go up. There is a lot of things that this telephone has to say. So those cells that are picking up to synapse with that vagus nerve, they are talking a lot to the brain. 10% of them, so all the things that we saw in the image that are in clinical text, where you see that the vagus nerve affects the lungs, affects the heart, affects the gut, affects the kidneys, that's 10% of the nerves that are in that bundle. The rest are coming upwards. So most of that communication is about the inflammation that's existing down there, about satiety, about how much energy, metabolism we're getting from our food. So most of the things that we've spoken about already. The 10% is all the more what it's doing. And one of the things that's really important is called vagal tone. It's like a muscle. You don't want your muscle to be super tight. You also don't want it to be super lax or slack. What you really need is toning in your muscles so it's ready to respond. So vagal tone is, if your vagus nerve was always relaxed, you would have vasovagal syncope. You would fall into a puddle on the floor. You'd be so relaxed that you wouldn't want to do anything. But if the tension is high, you've got that fight and flight response. This parasympathetic nervous system doesn't want to turn on. And so what we work for in a more clinical setting is to be focused on how do you influence the vagus nerve. And so what has been done in the past has been what's called vagal nerve stimulation, which in psychiatry was a practice, and it's like an electric stimulation to the vagus nerve. So that we know has an impact on, it has been used for depression, major depression. But there are other things that we do in our daily lives that affect that vagus nerve tone. And so some of that is the nutrients that we intake. So you're gonna hear eat healthy for the whole hour. It's just like eat healthy. But two of the things that have just started to come to the forefront in the research is relaxation grieving. So very specific types of breathing, and safety and belonging. So that's something that when you start to look at the different way of imagining how the vagus nerve looks and operates in the body, you can start to see that it's picking up on things, it's not just doing things. So when we are in a space that we don't feel like we belong, there's a sense of a lack of safety for food, shelter, water, many different pieces, that the sympathetic nerve loses its tone and it starts to become tight, the sympathetic nervous system starts to trigger. And so what we're looking for is breathing as one option, belonging and safety as another option, and then the type of foods. And so what they've done in research studies, and the first time they found it was in 2009. It was the actual rate of breathing that changes what's called heart rate variability. And that is what we call vagal tone. And in 2009, what they discovered that the rate is 6 breaths per minute. So that's 1 breath every 10 seconds. And they didn't just like sit people in a room and say, you breathe for 4, you breathe for 6, you breathe for 10, which is kind of neat, but it's strange. What they watched was people who were doing ritual. So people who did rosary beads or meditation beads or all different sorts of ways of navigating religious ritual. That's what they were watching and breathing and pacing, and they were measuring heart rate variability. And so it just turns out that across many cultures, that rate of 6 breaths per minute matches many rituals. And so I'd just like us to practice that. Let's make a ritual of that. And so generally, when we say take a deep breath, we take a big inhale, but then we go fast on the exhale. And so when someone says 6 breaths per minute, it doesn't mean inhale for 6 counts, right? For 10 seconds. What it means is extend your inhale, but then get a really long exhale. So we're gonna do that together. So when you exhale, one of the key things, for many reasons, but just to help you extend your exhale, is don't breathe out through pursed lips. It's way harder to breathe out for a long time. What you want to do is breathe out with an open mouth. So like, don't breathe into the person next to you. What you want to do is have like a, and imagine, I mean, this is a technique used in a lot of meditation and yoga is like you're trying to fog up a mirror. I'd say like you're trying to not blow out a birthday candle. And what we'll do is I'll count you in. So we'll do a 4 count inhale and a 6 count exhale. There's other reasons for being able to do that exhale. One of them is when you have a longer exhale, you're shifting the carbon dioxide content of your blood, not to the point where it's damaging. And carbon dioxide is one of the triggers for GABA, which is a neurotransmitter that is one of the only inhibitory neurotransmitter. So you're able to increase your calming response by changing the carbon dioxide in your blood by changing your breathing pace. Yeah? Okay, we're gonna take a nice big inhale and let it out fast. Feels good already, but we're not even at the good stuff. Okay, we're gonna take an inhale for 4. It's hard. And then exhale. Don't blow out the birthday candle. You can keep going, right? That is working on your vagal tone. How simple is that? To do that, right, I mean, you just did it then, and if you measured your heart rate variability, maybe, but if you did it for 10 minutes, you would see changes in your vagal response immediately. And what we're looking for is patterns. We're not looking for this to be, you can use this in a panic moment, but we're looking for patterns of behavior so that you can use those tools when you need them, and you don't have extremely tight muscle, but you don't have a lax muscle. It's not a muscle, but the nerve has a responsiveness. So you can activate that part of your body because you've trained it. So that's one of the things that we can do. The other is what Dr. Finley and Dr. Wickles were speaking about, which is the biome. So that is, as they've spoken to, there's not a lot of research out there about what you could eat to affect your vagal tone. But what we know is that the bacteria are creating short-chain fatty acids, they're creating neurotransmitters, they're going through the vagus nerve to communicate upwards. And the one thing that we know is that bacteria, they're not, I would say sometimes I'm a mono food eater. Like I'll be like, I just want to eat red peppers all day. But bacteria, they like buffets. They go to buffets. That's how they like to generate community. And so the one thing that we know, like we don't know what bacteria exactly, which bacteria we need to have, which ones are really helping. We're still trying to figure that out. But we do know that the more variety of fiber that you give to a person's gut lining or through their gut system, the better community, the greater diversity you'll have in your bacterial output, essentially. And so one thing I like to remind people is fiber can be separated into what I call roughage, slowage, not a real word, fermented, also not a real word. But those 3 things are a way to start to categorize your fiber, because fiber comes across as like that whole bottom of the pyramid. But you have stuff that runs through you really quickly. If you're the fast and furious type of pooper, maybe do less roughage. Right? Like, it's starting to think of variety. The variety of fiber that you bring into your diet is more likely to influence your bacterial composition. And we don't know what that outcome is, but we do know that when the system is inflamed, when the poops are either really constipated or they're really loose, there's something happening in the gut lining which is translating up the vagus nerve. So we do what we can to regulate the bowels to communicate back up to the vagus nerve. Yeah? And then the last, which is the most important, so I'm gonna try to focus on it, is our connection to other people. And so what's really important is the sympathetic nervous system activates when we are emotionally isolated. And so this is a really key piece, is that it's not, isolation doesn't mean being alone. It has to do, so you could be very social or you could be very busy, seeing people a lot. But if you don't have a sense of somebody that you can connect with and feel you belong to a group of some sort, it's very difficult for your parasympathetic nervous system to activate. So your vagus nerve, your parasympathetic, is not just looking for danger, it's looking for belonging. And so in emotional isolation, what happens is we don't get a lot of feedback from our social world. We're social animals, we need other people. And when we don't get a lot of feedback from that, that's what the absent piece is, not a lot of feedback coming back, we tend to perpetuate that by doing antisocial behaviors. And so sometimes people think it's the opposite, that antisocial behavior people feed themselves into isolation, but in fact, it's the isolation that feeds antisocial behavior. The next level into that is what we're facing a lot right now, which is virtual connection. We get audio and visual ways of our sensory system feeling like we belong and we can hear, so it's a little bit better. But what we're looking for is proximity and intimacy. And intimacy doesn't need to be sexual. Intimacy is feeling a closeness and a capacity to feel heard and to be seen. And so to be close, physically close to somebody that you feel gets you, it tones the vagus nerve. And what I think of through that is that it's, so in an action point of view, it's being close to somebody. But when I think of the strolling capacity, it's the sensory experience. It's not just audio and we're trying to connect. So multiple senses are being used to feed into that vagus nerve so that it is strolling and picking up on so much more than just audio and visual. And that allows for pro-social behavior, so antisocial and pro-social. So when you see someone, when you see someone in these situations, either pro-social or antisocial, you can start to work backwards of like what they might be experiencing on the inside. So that's something important to remember about toning the vagus nerve, because previously we've just stimulated it and you had to go to a psychiatrist to get the diagnosis of depression, but there's ways that we can do that prior. So this is your vagal tone checklist. It's long, slow breaths, a mix of soluble and insoluble fiber. I don't put roughage and slowage on the slide, but think about that. And then closeness and connection. There's so much information out there about how this is all connected to the vagus nerve, so I didn't put references through it, but I do have a slide with references and I have more. Take a photo of it, I can send it, I can give you one study at a time. Like, I'm very open to sharing this because I really want people to understand how their vagus nerve works. I don't think we have the clarity of how the biome transmits up that. We're still trying to figure out how the diet influences it, but the actual nerve itself is so powerful and we have access to it. Have a wonderful week.